The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was filled with fear and panic. Ambassador Hyunwoo stood at the center of the massive room looking at thousands of alien faces from across the galaxy. His hands shook as he held the reports that would change everything. For 300 years, the galaxy had been peaceful under the Council rule, but now that peace was broken, the Vorthon Empire had come from the dark nebula like a nightmare made real. Their ships were not built like normal ships. They were grown like living creatures with teeth and claws and hungry eyes that glowed in the darkness of space. The Vorthon warriors were even more terrifying than their ships. They had been changed by science and magic until they felt no pain and knew no fear. They were perfect killing machines that followed orders without question. In just 6 months, the Vorthons had taken 47 star systems. They did not just conquer planets, they destroyed them. They turned beautiful worlds into breeding grounds for their war beasts. They took prisoners not to ransom or trade, but to feed to their monsters. Entire species had been wiped out or enslaved. The lucky ones died quickly in battle. Chancellor Sujin had tried to stop them with the Council military forces. She was the best military leader the galaxy had seen in centuries. Her fleets were massive and powerful, with the most advanced weapons and shields that science could create. She had sent 3 great fleets against the Vorthons, and all 3 had been destroyed. Her admirals were dead or captured, and her remaining ships were scattered across the galaxy, too afraid to fight. The council chamber echoed with arguments and shouting. Some members wanted to surrender and hoped the Vorthons would show mercy. Others wanted to gather every ship in the galaxy for one last desperate battle. A few suggested running away to another galaxy entirely. None of the ideas seemed like they would work. The Vorthons had made it clear they wanted total control of everything, and they would kill anyone who got in their way. In a small office far from the main chamber, a young researcher named Minho was searching through old computer files. He was looking for anything that might help against the Vorthons, any weapon or strategy or ally that had been forgotten. Most of the files were about peaceful species that had joined the Council willingly. Trade agreements and cultural exchanges and scientific cooperation filled the databases. Then Minho found something strange. Deep in the archives was a file about a species that had been contacted centuries ago, but had refused to join the Council. The species was called humans, and they lived on a planet called Earth in a small solar system far from the main trade routes. What made them interesting was not their technology, which was very primitive, but their history of war. The file said that humans had spent their entire existence fighting each other. They had developed weapons and tactics and strategies that no civilized species would ever think of using. They fought wars for resources and territory and ideas, and sometimes just because they did not like each other. The file mentioned something called special forces, which were elite warriors trained in what the report called unconventional warfare. Minho brought this information to Ambassador Hyunwoo, who was known for studying military history from all across the galaxy. Hyunwoo read the file carefully and became very interested in these humans. He had learned that sometimes the best ideas came from the most unexpected places. Maybe these primitive warriors who had spent centuries fighting each other knew something about war that the peaceful council had forgotten. Most of the council members laughed at the idea when Hyunwoo presented it to them. They said it was foolish to ask for help from a primitive species that had not even developed faster than light travel. They argued that if the advanced civilizations of the galaxy could not stop the Vorthons, then surely these humans could not help either. But Hyunwoo remembered reading about ancient wars where small groups of clever fighters had defeated much larger armies by using tactics that their enemies did not expect. He thought about desperate times calling for desperate measures. The Vorthons were advancing toward the core worlds where billions of innocent beings lived. Traditional warfare had failed completely. Maybe it was time to try something completely different. Against the protests of many council members, Hyunwoo got permission for a secret mission to Earth. The mission would be small and quiet, just him and a few other diplomats on a fast scout ship. They would make contact with these humans and see if any of them were willing to help. It was a very long shot, but with Vorthon forces getting closer to the capital worlds every day, they were running out of options and time. Captain Yeonseo prepared her scout ship for the journey to the human homeworld. The ship had advanced cloaking technology that would hide it from primitive human detection systems. She had read the files about human history and was not sure what to expect. The reports described them as violent and unpredictable, but also creative and determined. Some of their wars had lasted for decades, and some of their battles had involved millions of soldiers. As the small council ship prepared to leave for Earth, none of the crew could imagine what they would find there. They certainly did not expect that their desperate search for help would lead them to a single human warrior who would change everything. They had no idea that this primitive species had developed ways of fighting that would terrify even the Vorthans. The journey to Earth would take several days, even with their fastest engines. During that time, Hyunwoo studied every file about human warfare he could find. He read about something called guerrilla warfare, where small groups of fighters would attack larger armies and then disappear. He learned about psychological warfare, where the goal was to break the enemy spirit, rather than just destroy their bodies. The more he read, the more convinced he became that these humans might have exactly what the council needed. They had spent their entire history learning how to defeat enemies that were bigger and stronger and better equipped than they were. If anyone in the galaxy knew how to fight an impossible war, it would be them. As their ship approached the small blue and green world called Earth, Hyunwoo felt hope for the first time since the Vorthon invasion had begun. Somewhere on that planet was a warrior who might be able to save the galaxy from total destruction. He just had to find them and convince them to help. The Council scout ship appeared in the Earth solar system like a ghost materializing from the darkness of space. Captain Yeonseo guided the cloaked vessel toward the blue and green planet that the humans called home. She had never seen a world quite like Earth, with its swirling white clouds and vast oceans that reflected the light of its yellow star. It was beautiful in a way that made it hard to believe that such a peaceful-looking world could produce the violent warriors described in their files. The ship sensors picked up radio signals and primitive satellite networks orbiting the planet. The humans had technology, but it was very basic compared to what the rest of the galaxy used. Their fastest ships could barely leave their own solar system, and their weapons were still based on chemical explosives and metal projectiles. Yet somehow these primitive beings had developed military tactics that might save civilizations thousands of years more advanced than they were. Lieutenant Commander Jae-woo worked at the communications station trying to figure out how to make contact with the humans without causing panic. The research files had warned that humans were suspicious and paranoid about alien contact. Most of their entertainment stories about aliens involved invasion and conquest. If they approached the wrong way, the humans might attack or hide or simply refuse to believe they were real. Their first attempts at contact were complete disasters. They tried to reach human government leaders, but the response was immediate suspicion and fear. Military forces around the world went to high alert and weapons were pointed at the sky. The humans seemed to assume that any alien contact meant invasion and conquest. Captain Yeonseo quickly moved the ship away from populated areas to avoid making the situation worse. For 3 days they watched and listened, trying to understand human communication patterns and social structures. They learned that humans were divided into many different groups called nations that sometimes cooperated and sometimes fought each other. They had leaders called presidents and prime ministers and generals who made decisions for millions of people. Their military forces were constantly training for wars that might never happen. Then Lieutenant Commander Jae-woo detected something interesting. Human military forces were conducting training exercises in the middle of their largest ocean. Ships and aircraft from several different nations were working together in what they called joint operations. During one of these exercises, a small boat with a single human became separated from the main group due to equipment failure. This seemed like the perfect opportunity to make contact with a single human away from the panic and suspicion of their governments. Captain Yeonseo carefully approached the small boat and used their translation computers to communicate with the lone human. She expected fear or worship or complete disbelief. Instead, she got something completely unexpected. The human, who identified himself only as Tae-sung, showed no sign of panic when their ship appeared above his boat. He looked up at the alien vessel with calm interest and asked practical questions about their technology and their reasons for coming to Earth. When Captain Yeonseo explained that they needed help fighting a war, the human did not laugh or refuse to believe her. Instead, he asked for details about the enemy. Tae-sung wanted to know about Vorthon weapons and tactics and troop strength and ship capabilities. His questions were so precise and military-focused that Captain Yeonseo realized they were dealing with someone who understood warfare at a very deep level. This was not just an ordinary human, but a professional warrior who had spent his life learning how to fight and win battles. The human explained that he was what they called a Navy SEAL, which was part of an elite military unit trained for special operations. He had fought in conflicts all around his world, specializing in missions that regular military forces could not handle. When Captain Yeon Seo described the seemingly impossible task of defeating the Vorthons who had crushed every military force sent against them, Taesung simply nodded and said he had faced worse odds. Before Ambassador Hyunwoo was brought to the small boat to continue the conversation. He had expected to spend days or weeks convincing the humans to help them. Instead, he found himself talking to a warrior who was already analyzing their problem and thinking about solutions. Taesung asked to see all their intelligence data on Vorthon military operations. He wanted to study their enemy before making any commitments. The negotiation was surprisingly simple and direct. Taesung did not want payment in money or technology or promises of power. He did not ask for guarantees of safety or rewards for success. His only conditions were that he be allowed to see the battlefield personally and that he be given complete freedom to operate according to his own methods without interference from council military commanders. What impressed Ambassador Hyunwoo most was the human confidence. Here was a single warrior from a primitive world volunteering to face an enemy that had terrorized the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Either humans were completely insane, or they understood something about warfare that everyone else had missed. Based on what he had seen so far, Hyunwoo was beginning to suspect it was the latter. Taesung gathered his equipment from the small boat and came aboard the council ship. His gear was primitive by galactic standards, but it was clearly designed by people who understood combat. Every item had a specific purpose and everything was arranged for quick access in dangerous situations. The human moved through their advanced ship like he belonged there, adapting quickly to alien technology and procedures. During the journey away from Earth, Taesung asked constant questions about council military doctrine and galactic warfare. He seemed particularly interested in what he called rules of engagement and something called the Geneva Conventions that apparently limited how humans were allowed to fight each other. When he learned that the council military followed similar rules designed to minimize civilian casualties and preserve honor in battle, he shook his head sadly. The human explained that those rules worked fine when both sides agreed to follow them but became deadly disadvantages when facing an enemy who followed no rules at all. The Vorthons clearly did not care about honor or civilian casualties or fair fighting. They wanted to win by any means necessary, and that meant the council needed to be willing to do the same thing or they would lose everything. As their ship approached the war zone, Ambassador Hyunwoo found himself both excited and terrified about what would happen next. They had found their human warrior, but now they needed to see if he could really do what he claimed. The fate of billions of innocent beings across the galaxy might depend on whether this single primitive fighter could find a way to defeat an enemy that seemed impossible to beat. Captain Yeon Seo set course for Kepler Station, where the council military leadership was coordinating their desperate defense against the advancing Vorthon forces. Soon they would learn whether bringing a human into their war was the best decision they had ever made, or the last mistake they would ever live to regret. Kepler Station was the largest military facility in council space, stretching for hundreds of kilometers through the darkness between stars. The massive structure housed the command centers that coordinated the defense of 50 star systems and contained enough weapons and ships to protect entire worlds. When Taesung first walked through its gleaming corridors, he said nothing, but his eyes took in every detail like a professional evaluating a battlefield. General Da-Yoon met them at the main docking bay, surrounded by her senior staff officers. She was a veteran of dozens of conflicts and had commanded fleets that protected the galaxy for decades, but she had never dealt with anything like the Vorthon invasion. Her usually confident demeanor showed cracks of stress and exhaustion. When she looked at the human warrior in his simple military uniform, she could not hide her skepticism about what this primitive alien could possibly contribute to their war. The main briefing room fell completely silent when Taesung entered, followed by Ambassador Hyunwoo and Captain Yeon Seo. Officers from dozens of different species stared at the human, wondering what this strange creature was doing in their most secure military facility. Some whispered among themselves, questioning whether bringing an outsider into their desperate situation was wise or even legal. Under council military regulations, Captain Bora began the intelligence presentation with holographic displays showing the current military situation across the galaxy. Red markers indicated Vorthan-controlled systems, while blue showed areas still under Council protection. The red was spreading faster than the blue could retreat, and everyone in the room understood what that meant. If the current trend continued, the entire galaxy would be under Vorthan control within 2 years. The tactical displays showed Vorthan military capabilities in terrifying detail. Their bioships could repair themselves during battle, healing from damage that would destroy normal vessels. Their warriors fought with mechanical precision, never retreating, never showing mercy, and never making the kinds of mistakes that normal soldiers made under stress. Every engagement followed the same pattern, with the Vorthans appearing in overwhelming numbers and crushing all resistance. Before moving to their next target, Captain Bora explained how Vorthan forces operated like a perfect military machine, with each unit knowing exactly what every other unit was doing at all times. Their communication systems were biological rather than electronic, making them almost impossible to jam or intercept. Their command structure was so efficient that orders could be transmitted across entire fleets in seconds, and every warrior would respond instantly and perfectly. As the briefing continued, Tae-sung asked questions that surprised everyone in the room. He wanted to know about Vorthan supply lines and how they transported food and fuel and ammunition to their forward units. He asked about their communication protocols and whether individual commanders ever made independent decisions. When shown footage of Vorthan warriors in combat, he asked about their behavior patterns and how they responded when faced with unexpected situations. The humans seemed particularly interested in what happened to Vorthan forces when their commanders were killed or their communication systems were damaged. General Dayun admitted that there had been very few such incidents because Vorthan commanders were heavily protected, and their bio-neural networks were extremely difficult to disrupt. The few times it had happened, the results had been inconclusive because the battles had ended too quickly to observe long-term effects. After hours of detailed briefings about Vorthan capabilities and council failures, Tae-sung finally spoke his assessment. His words shocked everyone in the room, including the most experienced military officers who had spent their careers studying warfare. The humans said that the council had been fighting the Vorthans completely wrong from the very beginning, and that was why they kept losing. Tae-sung explained that the council military had been treating the Vorthans like they were just another enemy army that happened to be very good at conventional warfare. But the Vorthans were not really an army in the traditional sense. They were more like what humans called a cult, with every member programmed from birth to follow specific doctrines without question. That programming made them incredibly effective, but it also created weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who understood how to think differently. The human pointed to the tactical displays showing Vorthan advancement patterns across multiple star systems. He showed how their movements were not random, but followed predictable patterns based on their military doctrine. They always took the most direct route to their objectives. They always concentrated their forces for maximum impact. They always followed the same communication and command procedures. That predictability could be turned against them by an enemy who was willing to break all the normal rules of warfare. General Dayun leaned forward with growing interest, asking what the human was suggesting. Tae-sung smiled grimly and explained that the council had been trying to fight fire with fire by meeting the Vorthans, strength with strength. But sometimes the best way to fight fire was with water, by using completely different methods that the enemy had never encountered and did not know how to counter. The plan that Tae-sung outlined seemed like madness to most of the officers present. Instead of meeting the Vorthans in the massive fleet engagements, they seemed to prefer he wanted to use small fast ships to attack their supply lines and communication networks. Instead of fighting their strengths, he wanted to target their weaknesses by forcing them into situations their rigid doctrine had never prepared them for. The human talked about something he called asymmetric warfare, where a smaller, weaker force could defeat a larger, stronger enemy by refusing to fight on the enemy terms. He explained how human military forces had developed these tactics over thousands of years of conflict and how they had been used successfully against enemies that seemed impossible to defeat through conventional methods. Commander Yunji, who was one of the few council officers to survive direct combat against Vorthan forces, found herself nodding as Tae-sung spoke. She remembered how confused and disorganized the enemy had become, during the brief moments when their perfect coordination had been disrupted by unexpected events. Maybe this primitive human had discovered something that all their advanced military science had missed. The discussion continued for hours, with Taesung explaining human concepts like guerrilla warfare and psychological operations to officers who had never imagined such tactics could be effective against a technologically superior enemy. He talked about making the enemy fight on unfamiliar ground using unfamiliar methods while denying them the advantages their superior numbers and firepower normally provided. By the end of the briefing, General Da-Yun had made a decision that would either save the galaxy or doom it to complete destruction. She authorized Taesung to select volunteers from the Council military and begin training them in these human warfare techniques. If his methods worked, they would expand the program across all their forces. If they failed, they would have lost nothing more than time they probably did not have anyway. As the meeting ended and officers began filing out of the briefing room, many of them were talking quietly among themselves about what they had heard. Some thought the human plan was brilliant and revolutionary. Others believed it was the desperate fantasy of a primitive mind that did not understand modern warfare. All of them agreed that they were about to find out which opinion was correct. 3 weeks after the briefing at Kepler Station, a small council fleet hung in the darkness near the Nexus system, following a plan that most military experts would have called impossible suicide. The fleet consisted of only 12 fast attack ships, each one crewed by volunteers who had trained day and night with Taesung to learn human warfare tactics. These were not the massive battleships that the Council usually sent into combat, but small, quick vessels designed for speed and stealth rather than heavy fighting. Lieutenant Wu Jin commanded the lead ship, and she was still amazed at how different human military thinking was from everything she had learned at the prestigious Council Military Academy. Traditional warfare was about honor and fair fights and protecting innocent civilians, even when it made victory more difficult. Human warfare, as Taesung had explained, was about winning by any means necessary, even if those means seemed brutal or unfair to civilized minds. The human had insisted on leading this first mission personally, despite angry protests from General Da-Yun and the other council leaders. They argued that losing him would destroy their entire strategy before it had a chance to work. Taesung had replied that his warriors needed to see him take the same risks he was asking them to take. Leadership by example, he called it, and it was apparently a very important concept in human military culture. The Vorthan convoy appeared exactly on schedule, just as their intelligence reports had predicted. 50 massive bioships moved through space like living mountains, carrying troops and supplies to the front lines, where they would be used to conquer more council worlds. 20 escort warships surrounded the convoy in a protective formation that had never been successfully broken by any council force. Lieutenant Wu Jin watched her sensors as the enemy fleet approached and tried to calm her racing heart. By traditional military doctrine, attacking such a large force with only 12 small ships would be certain death. The Vorthans had enough firepower to destroy her entire fleet in minutes. But Taesung had explained that they were not going to fight a traditional battle. They were going to do something the Vorthans had never experienced before. The human voice crackled over the communication system, reminding everyone of their mission objectives. They were not there to destroy the convoy in a glorious battle. They were there to disrupt it and confuse it and make the Vorthans chase them into a carefully prepared trap. Success would be measured not by how many enemy ships they destroyed, but by how badly they could damage Vorthan confidence and coordination. Taesung's ship darted forward like a striking snake, launching a spread of missiles at the convoy communication relay ship. The missiles were not powerful enough to destroy the massive bioship, but they were precisely targeted at its most vulnerable systems. Explosions bloomed across the creature hull, damaging its ability to coordinate with the rest of the fleet and sending confusion rippling through the enemy formation. What happened next amazed every council officer who witnessed it. Instead of maintaining their protective formation and continuing toward their objective, the entire Vorthan escort fleet turned to pursue Taesung's small force. The bioships, suddenly without proper coordination from their escorts, began to cluster together defensively. Rather than continuing their mission to the front lines, the Saidiri chase that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic military history. Taesung led the Vorthan ships through a carefully planned route that took them deep into an asteroid field, where the Council ship's superior maneuverability gave them a crucial advantage. The human had spent days studying the terrain and plotting the exact course they would follow when the enemy took the bait. But this was not just a desperate retreat from superior forces. It was a carefully orchestrated trap that had been prepared over several weeks by Council engineering teams working under Taesung's direction. Hidden throughout the asteroid field were automated weapon platforms and sensor, decoys and communication jammers, all positioned to create maximum chaos when the Vorthons arrived. As the enemy ships spread out to surround their prey, they began taking fire from multiple directions. The Vorthon bioships had evolved for direct combat against other large vessels, and they struggled to adapt to fighting an enemy that refused to stand still and fight fairly. Every time they thought they had cornered the human ships, their targets would slip away through gaps in the asteroids, leaving behind more automated weapons and holographic decoys. The engagement lasted for 6 long hours as the Council ships led their pursuers deeper into the trap. Vorthon commanders who had never experienced such unconventional tactics began making mistakes as they tried to adapt to a situation their training had never prepared them for. Ships collided with asteroids while trying to follow impossible flight paths. Others wasted ammunition firing at sensor decoys that looked exactly like real targets. Lieutenant Wu Jin found herself laughing with excitement as her ship danced between asteroids while enemy fire exploded harmlessly around her. She had trained for this moment, but experiencing it in real combat was completely different from any simulation. The human tactics worked exactly as Taesung had promised, turning their small force into something that seemed much larger and more dangerous than it really was. The turning point came when several Vorthon ships became separated from their main force while chasing false targets through a particularly dense section of asteroids. Taesung had positioned his most experienced pilots to exploit exactly this kind of opportunity. Concentrated fire from multiple Council ships destroyed 3 enemy vessels in quick succession. The first, Vorthon losses in months of continuous victories. More importantly, the destruction of those ships seemed to trigger some kind of panic response in the remaining Vorthon forces. Without their perfect coordination, they began making increasingly desperate moves to try to trap the elusive Council ships. Some crashed into asteroids while others fired on their own forces in the confusion. The perfect military machine that had terrorized the galaxy was falling apart when faced with an enemy that refused to follow the expected rules. When the battle finally ended, the results exceeded everyone's most optimistic predictions. The Vorthon convoy had lost half its escort ships and had been forced to abandon its mission entirely. For the first time since the war began, Vorthon forces had been forced to retreat from a battlefield. More importantly, they had been defeated by a tiny force using tactics that made no sense according to traditional military thinking. The victory sent shock waves through both the Council and the Vorthon Empire. News of the impossible triumph spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Worlds that had been preparing for inevitable conquest suddenly had hope again. Military officers who had been planning desperate last stands began asking for information about human warfare tactics. But Taesung was not celebrating as his battered ship returned to Kepler Station. He had learned something important about the Vorthons during the battle, and he was already planning the next phase of his campaign. The enemy could be confused and disrupted, but they would adapt to these new tactics eventually. The window of opportunity was limited, and he intended to make the most of it while the advantage lasted. As Lieutenant Wu Jin guided her ship into the docking bay, she realized that everything had changed. The impossible enemy was not really impossible after all. They could be beaten, but only by someone willing to think completely differently about warfare. The human had shown them the way, but now the real work would begin. The success of the Nexus raid changed everything across the galaxy in ways that no one had expected. Within days of the news reaching other Council worlds, Admiral Jin Ho found himself facing a problem he never thought he would have. Too many volunteers were requesting transfers to what the media had started calling the Human Division. Officers and crew members from every species in the Council were abandoning safe assignments to learn the strange new tactics that had defeated the impossible enemy. Even species that had never shown any interest in military service were suddenly asking to join the fight. Engineers wanted to build new weapons based on human designs. Scientists wanted to study human psychology to understand how they thought about warfare. Diplomats wanted to learn human negotiation techniques. The primitive species from the small blue planet had become the most popular subject of study in the entire galaxy. Taesung had established a training facility on a remote moon where he taught council personnel the basics of what he called unconventional warfare. The classes were unlike anything that had ever been seen in military academies across the galaxy. Instead of learning about honor and glory and proper battlefield conduct, the students learned about deception and misdirection and psychological manipulation. It was during one of these training sessions that Captain Seobin finally understood why human tactics were so effective against enemies like the Vorthans. Traditional military thinking focused on destroying the enemy ability to fight by damaging their ships and killing their warriors. Human tactics focused on destroying the enemy will to fight by making them doubt their own superiority and question their mission. Taesung explained to his students that fear was their most powerful weapon, but not fear for their own safety. The Vorthans had been bred to feel no personal fear, and they would fight to the death without hesitation. But they could feel fear for their mission and their objectives and their perfect order, make them doubt that they were truly invincible, and they would start making the kinds of mistakes that could be exploited. The lessons were already paying off on battlefields across the galaxy as council forces began using human-inspired tactics against Vorthan positions. Commander Hyun-soo had successfully destroyed a major supply depot by disguising his ships as space debris and waiting motionless for 3 days before attacking. The Vorthans had completely ignored what appeared to be harmless wreckage until it was too late. Lieutenant Colonel So Young had achieved an even more spectacular success using what Taesung called psychological warfare. She had used captured Vorthan communication equipment to broadcast false messages to an entire battle group, convincing them that they were surrounded by invisible enemies. The confused Vorthans had begun firing on their own ships, believing they were under attack from cloaked vessels that did not actually exist, but the most significant victory came when Captain Namsik successfully captured a Vorthan commander alive during a boarding action. For the first time since the war began, the council had a chance to interrogate one of their enemies and learn about their internal structure and organization. What they discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The Vorthan prisoner revealed that their entire species functioned as a kind of biological computer network, with each individual programmed to follow orders, without question or independent thought. They had no concept of individual creativity or personal initiative. Every action they took was determined by instructions received from their superiors, who in turn followed orders from their own commanders all the way up to the mysterious Vorthan Emperor. Taesung saw tremendous opportunity in this rigid command structure. If the Vorthans were programmed to follow orders absolutely, then the key to defeating them was to disrupt their ability to receive those orders. Cut the connection between commanders and troops, and the entire system would break down like a computer with damaged circuits. The human proposed something that shocked even the most progressive council military leaders. Instead of trying to destroy Vorthan fleets in direct combat, they should focus on infiltration missions designed to capture or eliminate enemy commanders. Break the chain of command and leave entire fleets without direction or purpose. The first such mission was launched against the Vorthan staging area in the Sigma system, where a massive fleet was preparing for an assault on the Council Core worlds. Major Kangdae led a small team of specialists who had been trained in human infiltration techniques. Their objective was not to destroy anything, but to capture the fleet commander and the bio-neural computers that controlled fleet operations. The mission required skills that no Council military force had ever developed before. The team had to sneak past security systems that could detect even the smallest energy signatures. They had to move through enemy ships without being seen by warriors who had enhanced senses. Most difficult of all, they had to capture their targets alive and intact when every Vorthan was programmed to fight to the death, using techniques that Taesung had learned during his years of special operations on Earth. The infiltration team succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. They not only captured the fleet commander, but also obtained complete intelligence about Vorthan military plans for the next 6 months. More importantly, they proved that even the most secure enemy positions could be penetrated by warriors who were willing to think creatively. With their command structure disrupted, the entire Vorthan fleet in the Sigma system began to fall apart like a machine with broken gears. Ships that had fought in perfect coordination for centuries suddenly could not communicate effectively with each other. Some continued their original missions while others returned to defensive positions. A few simply shut down completely and drifted, in space waiting for new orders that never came. Within a month, what had started as desperate raids by a handful of ships had grown into a galaxy-wide resistance movement. Human tactics were being adapted and modified by military units across the Council territories. For the first time since the war began, Vorthon forces were experiencing something they had never felt before. Uncertainty and doubt were spreading through their ranks like a virus. The psychological impact was even more important than the military victories. Vorthon warriors who had believed they were invincible were beginning to question their own superiority. Some began hesitating before following orders. Others showed signs of what human psychologists would recognize as stress and anxiety. The perfect biological machines were developing, flaws that could be exploited. Reports began coming in from across the galaxy of Vorthon forces retreating from forward positions without being directly defeated in battle. Some fleets simply disappeared entirely, abandoning conquered worlds for no apparent reason. Intelligence analysts reported that internal communications within the Vorthon Empire were becoming increasingly chaotic and contradictory. Taesung had achieved something that the galaxy's greatest military minds had thought was completely impossible. He had taken an enemy that seemed truly invincible and shown that they could be defeated by anyone willing to abandon traditional thinking about warfare. But as success followed success, the human knew that the real war was just beginning. The Vorthon Empire had been embarrassed by defeats at the hands of primitive tactics used by inferior species. Their response would be swift and brutal and overwhelming. Emperor Vectar himself would soon arrive with forces large enough to crush any resistance. The galaxy was about to face its greatest test, and everything would depend on whether the lessons they had learned could be applied on a scale large enough to matter when it really counted. The Vorthon response came like a storm of fire and death sweeping across the galaxy toward the Council core worlds. Emperor Vectar himself arrived at the head of the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. 3,000 bioships, each one a living weapon of mass destruction accompanied by support vessels that defied counting, filled the space between stars like a plague of metal and flesh, hungry for revenge. The message was clear to everyone who saw the massive armada approaching. The Vorthons would no longer tolerate the humiliation they had suffered at the hands of primitive human tactics. They were coming to end the war once and for all with overwhelming force that would crush any resistance. Every world in their path would be reduced to ash, and every species that had dared to defy them would be exterminated completely. General Da-Un stood in the command center of Kepler Station, watching the sensor displays with a mixture of awe and terror that made her hands shake. The approaching Vorthon fleet was so large that their computers could not accurately count all the individual ships. Traditional military analysis suggested that defeat was not just inevitable, but would happen so quickly that most Council forces would never even have a chance to fight. But beside her, Taesung studied the same displays with the calm focus of a predator selecting its prey. The human had changed during the month since his arrival, becoming more confident and more dangerous as he learned to think on a galactic scale. His simple military uniform now carried the insignia of a Council War Advisor, a rank that had been created specifically for him. "They are making a mistake," the human said quietly as he pointed to the massive enemy formation. "They are so angry about our raids that they have abandoned their own military doctrine. Look at their formation. It is designed for intimidation rather than tactical efficiency. They want to crush us in one giant battle to prove their superiority once and for all." Taesung turned to General Da-Un with a grim smile that reminded her why humans had spent their entire history fighting each other. "We are going to give them exactly what they want," he said. "But it will be a battle fought on our terms, using our tactics with our advantages. They think they are coming to end the war, but they are actually walking into the largest trap in galactic history." The plan that Taesung outlined was his most audacious and dangerous yet. Instead of avoiding the massive Vorthon fleet or trying to delay its advance, he wanted to engage it directly in the kind of massive space battle that would decide the fate of the entire galaxy. But it would not be the traditional fleet engagement that Emperor Vectar expected. It would be something completely different. Using every available ship in the Council fleet, Taesung would create the appearance of a conventional military engagement, while actually implementing human warfare tactics on a scale never before attempted. The battle would take place at the Horizon Nebula, where the dense gas clouds and electrical storms would provide perfect cover for the unconventional tactics that had proven so effective in smaller engagements. Admiral Seok Jin commanded the main Council fleet as it moved to intercept the Vorthons at the predetermined location. On paper, it looked like a traditional fleet engagement with two massive armadas meeting in open space to settle their differences through superior firepower and tactical skill. But hidden throughout the nebula were hundreds of small ships automated, weapon platforms and sensor decoys all positioned according to Taesung's master plan. The human himself would fly a small stealth ship equipped with the most advanced cloaking technology that Council science could produce. His mission was the most dangerous and important of all. He would penetrate deep into the heart of the Vorthon formation and disrupt their command structure from within, while the main battle raged around him. The battle began exactly as the Vorthons expected, with the two fleets engaging at long range and trading massive volleys of energy weapons and missiles. The Vorthon bioships pressed forward, confident in their numerical superiority and overwhelming firepower. Emperor Vectar led from the front in his flagship, a massive creature that had consumed entire planets to fuel its growth and evolution. But as the engagement progressed, the Vorthons began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Their perfect formations kept breaking apart as ships lost communication with their commanders for no apparent reason. Supply vessels exploded without warning, victims of mines and automated weapon platforms that seemed to appear from nowhere in the swirling nebula gases. Most disturbing of all, their enemies seemed to know exactly where every Vorthon ship would be at any given moment, as if someone had access to their most secret tactical plans. Coordinated attacks struck at weak points in their formation with precision that should have been impossible. Ships that should have been safe behind multiple layers of protection found themselves under fire from directions that made no tactical sense. That someone was Taesung flying his small stealth ship through the chaos of the massive battle like a ghost haunting the enemy fleet. Using intelligence gathered from captured Vorthon commanders, he had learned how to disrupt their bio-neural communication networks. Every few minutes he would target another command ship, severing its connection to the hive mind and leaving entire squadrons confused and directionless. The turning point came when the human reached Emperor Vectar flagship deep in the center of the Vorthon formation. The massive bioship was protected by layers of escort vessels and defensive systems that made it seemingly impregnable. But Taesung had learned to think like his enemy, and he knew that the most heavily defended targets often had the most exploitable weaknesses. Instead of trying to fight through the defensive perimeter, the human allowed his ship to be captured by the enemy flagship tractor beams. The Vorthons thought they had finally caught their most elusive opponent, but they had actually invited him inside their most critical command center. Using explosives hidden throughout his equipment, Taesung destroyed the ship command center from within, taking Emperor Vectar with him in the explosion. With their emperor dead and their command structure in complete chaos, the Vorthon fleet began to collapse like a house built from cards. Ships that had fought in perfect coordination for thousands of years suddenly found themselves unable to work together effectively. Some continued fighting while others tried to retreat, and many simply drifted aimlessly, waiting for orders that would never come. The Battle of Horizon Nebula lasted 18 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the Vorthon invasion force. But more importantly, it marked the end of the Vorthon Empire as a threat to galactic civilization. Without their rigid command structure, their remaining forces fragmented into isolated groups that could be dealt with by conventional Council military units. As the surviving Council ships regrouped after the victory, they found Taesung escape pod floating in the debris field. The human was injured but alive, and his first words were typical of the warrior who had changed the course of galactic history. "Not bad for a primitive species, right?" he said with a weak smile that made everyone who heard it laugh with relief and joy. The galaxy was safe, and it had been saved not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by the courage and ingenuity of a single human warrior who had refused to accept that some enemies were impossible to defeat. The Galactic Council would remember this lesson for generations to come, and the name Taesung would be honored on 1,000 worlds as the alien who taught them that victory was always possible for those brave enough to think differently about how wars should be fought.